Hello everyone, my name is Connor Langendorf. I am presenting on behalf of my IAH 206 class at Michigan State University. The topic of this class is global climate change and the reasons why climate change may be occurring. My role in this class is to be the hypothetical think tank for the country of Russia, and in that assist Russia in defining climate change problems and giving recommendations on how to act in the future. The first task the think tank was given was to identify vulnerabilities and opportunities of climate change in Russia. This meant researching the various aspects of Russian people to see if climate change affected them in a positive or negative way. This next slide shows the political opportunities and vulnerabilities of climate change in Russia. As yearly temperatures rise in Russia, some areas experience winters that are less harsh. When the winters and summers are warmer, Russian workers have been shown to be more productive and equipment fails less often. This productivity drives the Russian economy. However, at the same time, Russia's dense boreal forests may show the inability to adapt to the rising temperatures and die. This is a problem because trees use up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which helps slow global warming. This moves us toward the social impact of climate change. In the same instance as the previous slide, we can see that as temperatures rise, the Russian environment changes. This change may see an increase in tourism, which allows local business more opportunity to earn money and stimulate the Russian economy. On the downside of that, the rising temperatures make it easier to fish in the icy waters around Russia. This ease of fishing could cause more commercial fishing to develop, creating more competition for the local fishing industry. Rising temperatures also affect Russian culture. As the seasons change, the way of life of Russian people also changes. These changes could be both positive and negative. Russian people could be happy that the winters are shorter because they wouldn't have to heat their houses long and they could enjoy the summer longer. Or the climate change could ruin the winter traditions that people have been supporting for centuries and they have learned to live in. Russian culture has adapted to the cold and the activities and traditions that go with it, especially in the culture of indigenous peoples. Rising temperatures do have other effects on the environment. For example, the rising temperatures cause the icebergs and polar sea ice to melt. This melting sea ice allows for more locations for oil drilling that were previously impossible to reach, giving Russia even more valuable resources. However, as described before, the rising temperatures put the boreal forest in danger. This causes an economic vulnerability because Russia exports a large amount of lumber, and losing its forests means losing money. And finally, that brings us to the ecological opportunities and vulnerabilities of climate change in Russia. Permafrost is a layer of earth that is frozen year-round and covers large areas of Russia, and unfortunately cannot be farmed. However, as the temperatures rise and permafrost melts, it frees up large amounts of land that can be farmed or occupied. This does cause problems, though, because as the Russian landscape begins to melt, water can accumulate and cause flooding. The flooding can uproot Russian families, cause widespread property damage, and even death. The next task was to identify the carbon footprint of Russia. The responsibility of the think tank was to do research on how and when Russia industrialized, how Russia has affected its forests, and the recent contributions Russia has made to climate change. During the 1890s, Russia began industrializing very quickly. Russia has a vast number of natural resources, and this abundance helped them compete with other countries industrializing at the same time. Russia was developing fast, the railway system exploded, and Russia was on pace to become one of the largest populations of its time. Looking at the graphs on the right, the highest average temperatures from 1900 to 1930 were 13.8 degrees Celsius, and the highest average temperatures from 1930 to 1960 were 14.3 degrees Celsius. This is an increase of 0.5 degrees Celsius. As time went on, Russian growth slowed considerably, as many poor decisions of the Soviet Union allowed other countries to surpass Russia. Because of the slowed growth, Russia leaned on its natural resources in order for the country to stay at pace. In 1998, Russia was officially inducted into the Group of Eight, which is the collection of the most industrialized countries in the world. The pie chart on the right shows that Russia has been responsible for 6% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, putting it fourth behind the United States, China, and the European Union. Deforestation is a huge problem in terms of climate change because, as mentioned before, forests take in large amounts of carbon dioxide. When trees get cut down, the amount of CO2 that they can take in diminishes. Along with deforestation, the melting of massive peat bogs in Russia works the same way. These bogs have been frozen for hundreds of years and store methane, a greenhouse gas. As temperatures rise, the permafrost melts, releasing dangerous amounts of methane into the atmosphere. Trends in urbanization can also correlate to greenhouse gas emissions. The bar chart on the right shows the Russian census from 1897 to 2002. Russian growth has leveled in the last 2 decades as a result of the struggling economy. As time goes on, the Russian population grew and more people moved to the cities. This also occurred during a time of increased anthropogenic activity, or an increase in fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emission. The three line charts on this slide show the values of the total coal consumption, total natural gas consumption, and the total petroleum consumption since 1992. The information that is most pertinent is the rankings of Russian fossil fuel usage. Russia is ranked in the top 5 for all categories of fossil fuel usage and is number 2 in global natural gas usage. The two bar charts on this slide depict the top 10 emitters of greenhouse gases and the per capita emissions of the top 10 emitters. The values of the per capita graph are determined by dividing the emission values of the country by its population. This shows what the average person of the country produces for greenhouse gas. In Russia's case, every Russian citizen produces double the world average. Russia is led by only the United States and Canada in this statistic. It is important to look at different groups of people and how climate change effects can vary between them. The next task of the think tank was to research various groups of people in Russia and determine how that group felt climate change. Determining how strong a country is financially is helpful in gauging the ability to react to financial changes. This slideshow shows the breakup of Russian national income. As you can see, the top 20% of Russian citizens make almost the same amount as the middle 60%. This leaves a staggering 5% of the nation's income to be split between 28.7 million Russian citizens. This makes the poorest Russians vulnerable to financial changes due to global warming. Learning how different groups produce emissions can determine what groups need emissions restrictions and which do not. Cities are areas that large amounts of greenhouse gases are released in a contained area due to traffic, and urban living produces greenhouse gas in the form of commuting. Both of these groups produce significantly more greenhouse gas than indigenous peoples do. Their simplistic lifestyle produces little or no climate change effects and offers an example of how other people should try and live. Another aspect to look at is a group's capacity to adapt to climate change. For example, religious people's beliefs may affect how they view climate change. Whether this view is the end of days or not, they might not be willing to accept that climate change is of human beings doing, but more of a greater power. Another example is how farmers and fishermen adapt to climate change in a changing environment by seeking out new fishing territory and farming land once plagued with permafrost. One of the vulnerable populations that the think tank focused on was women. Women are a vulnerable population for several reasons. The first is that in Russian society, women typically make less money than men. This makes them susceptible to financial changes due to climate change. The other reason is that they have a very small voice in government. 13% of the Russian State Duma and 6% of the federal level is comprised of women, giving them less leverage in climate change debates. Poor people were another group that research was compiled on. Poor people are vulnerable because they cannot change financially with a changing world. They might find it hard to buy fuel-efficient cars or energy-saving appliances to do their part in the climate change fight. They are environmentally vulnerable as well because as the landscape changes, for example, as permafrost melts, the foundations of homes may sink and cause structural damage. This could be a death sentence for someone who cannot afford to fix his or her home. The way of life for indigenous people separates them from Russian society by the way of technology. However, they do not have the ability to change financially, like women and poor people, because they choose to live off the land. In addition to that, many indigenous tribes are dictated by the Russian government and may be forced to move around against their will. The last population that the think tank researched was the elderly. Russia has a poor life expectancy of 69 years, has a very low income security compared to other countries in the world, and many elderly are very poor and have to continue to work just to survive. The elderly are particularly vulnerable because of any significant changes in the environment are harmful to the elderly because they are more susceptible to injury and disease. In order to adapt to climate change as a country, Russia must be willing to give up certain aspects of the present to protect the future. The think tank has produced 5 examples of trade offs that Russia should consider. The first would be regulating emissions of businesses. This would allow the Russian government to complete control on emission levels, but make life harder for business owners. The second would be carefully balance how much time is put into climate change efforts so that other problems are not put aside. Third, funding climate change research is important, but would take money away from Russia's weak economy and slow much needed medicinal research. Fourth, stiffer regulations of the lumber industry would limit the rate of deforestation, therefore expanding the ability of the forests to take up carbon dioxide. But the lumber industry would lose product and money. And lastly, the fifth and most difficult trade off would be to invest in the research of alternative fuels. This is difficult because it would take the importance away from Russia's vast oil and gas fields that have driven the economy for years. Another task assigned to the think tank was to look at how Russia has acted politically towards climate change. This involved looking at what world environmental groups and organizations Russia has participated in, such as the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol over the years, and if Russia's position has changed over time. The first group that the think tank looked at was the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or better known as the UNFCCC. Russia became part of the UNFCCC in 1992 and entered the force in 1995. The main goal of the UNFCCC is to bring countries together on a platform to discuss climate change issues, develop plans to help curb global warming, and set goals and emission standards for various countries and areas. The other group that research was done on is the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol is a global organization that sets emission standards for countries to stay under. The Kyoto Protocol is comprised of countries that account for at least 55% of global CO2 emissions. Russia joined the Kyoto Protocol in 2002 and pledged to cut 5.2% of greenhouse gas pollution of the Russian country in 1990 by 2012. The Kyoto Protocol officially started in 2005. As of 2012, Russia has withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol, claiming that they did not receive any benefits from participating. In order to keep up with other countries fighting climate change, Russia has been involved in other groups and panels. An example of this is the Panel for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, or REDD+. Russia has also participated in several joint implementation projects. These are climate change projects that Russia has teamed up with other countries to complete. In addition, Russia has recently confirmed over 100 other projects that account for 311.6 million tons of emission reductions. Looking at how Russian policies affected climate change can show the changes in greenhouse gas emissions over time. After the Soviet Union fell, large amounts of farmland was abandoned and returned to the wild. This negative progress allowed for large uptakes of CO2. Another thing to look at is how Russia views itself in the climate change world. Climate experts believe that Russia feels it is neither a major donor nor recipient of climate change, and therefore this affects how the government acts in reacting to the climate change. During international debates, Russia shows that it wants to be a world superpower, so they want their voice to be heard. Russia has shown its frustration with other countries on the international level at the UNFCCC in Bonn, Germany. Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine feel as if their opinions were not being heard, so they block the agenda of the conference leaders. Russia and the aforementioned countries have lots of hot air credits saved up from the Kyoto Protocol, and since the Kyoto Protocol is failing, the UNFCCC is moving on, and Russia wants compensation for what it has achieved. After all the research on vulnerabilities and opportunities of climate change, the carbon footprint of Russia, the various groups of Russian people, and how Russia has politically handled climate change, the final task of the think tank was to develop potential solutions to climate change. The think tank developed a 5-step recommendation as to what Russia should do next. The first step is to offer clean energy incentives to commercial and residential buildings. This program basically offers consumers a rebate on the product if the product is energy efficient. There are some costs with this, however, because the government would have to front the money for the program. The success of this program lies in the hands of the Russian citizens, so it is important that they realize the importance of it. The second step was mentioned previously in the presentation, but that is to regulate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that a business can produce. This is an expensive step because it costs the government money to fund a team of people to go around and make sure that they are following regulations. It also causes the businesses time and money to abide by these rules. However, future generations would appreciate the healthier and cleaner living environment. The third step is to become better advocates for the boreal forests. The boreal forests are a pivotal piece in developing a plan to counteract climate change. Russia is deforested at an alarming rate, and protecting the forest is a must. Russia somewhat depends on the timber industry for income, so that will have to be downsized, but future generations will be able to enjoy the forests without fear that they will be cut down or destroyed. The fourth step is to implement a fuel efficiency standard for all cars of all sizes as well as other forms of transportation. This may also involve developing engines that run on alternative fuels. This is important not only in the fact that fuel efficient cars are less harmful to the environment, but also that fossil fuels have a lifespan. At some point in the time of mankind, we will run out of fossil fuels, and it is important to protect the future generations by doing research now. The last step coincides with the previous step. That is, to fund alternative energy research and development and loosen the grip that the Russian economy has on oil and gas. Renewable power is the number one goal in reversing global warming. This is the most expensive step and the most important because using alternative energy can do several things. It lowers the output of greenhouse gases, it is a cheaper source of energy, and it will pay itself off faster than oil and gas, and the longevity of alternative energy vastly outweighs fossil fuels. This gives future generations an energy source when all oil fields are depleted. It is believed that with this recommendation that Russia can once again be at the top of the world leaderboard. Russia has been unfortunately riddled with terrible leadership and government that has stunted its growth for over 100 years. Russia has all the right tools to be a world superpower: landmass, vast natural resources, and a population that has room to grow. The recommendation allows Russia to utilize its resources, become extremely efficient in terms of energy saving, and use that to rebound its economy. The last thing the think tank looked at was how the recommendations affect the vulnerable populations of Russia. The greenhouse gas regulations of the government would produce more jobs and give women an opportunity to become involved in the Russian government. If an alternative energy source was utilized, the elderly as well as the poor would have access to cheaper electricity. And finally, the lessened need to drill for oil would keep the Russian oil industry away from the land of the indigenous people and allow them to live free of societal interference. The think tank discovered a lot of different aspects about Russia, and more importantly, how these aspects affected climate change. There are opportunities and vulnerabilities that come with climate change, but the main goal is to maximize the good and minimize the bad. Even if Russia becomes the lowest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, it will not matter if other countries do not do their part as well. That is why international effort is important and why groups like the UNFCCC are vital and beneficial to the lives that we lead today. The think tank offered a very good recommendation on things that need to change in order for Russia to do its part in climate change, but that does not include everything. Any small change in everyday life adds up, and hopefully as people learn and realize that the world we live in is changing, that people will try and do more to stop climate change. Thank you.